Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us once again. I want to thank all of you who've been joining us throughout the years. It's always been a pleasure and honor to broadcast information, news, analysis about what's going on in Mexico, both in English and in Spanish. Joining us today is Alejandro Hope. You know him well. He's been joining us throughout the years. He's one of Mexico's premier experts on security, public security, national security, and we've had the opportunity to talk to him quite frequently since 2005, since we've been broadcasting this show. But today, Alejandro, once again, Alejandro, welcome to the show. Let's talk about what happened this week in the Mexican Senate in terms of the debate that took place, in which we have to say, the proposal, although it comes from the PRI in the lower house, but it is the proposal of President Manuel López Obrador, which seeks to amend the Constitution to make sure that Mexico's armed forces will have the responsibility of participating in public security matters and public security issues. There wasn't sufficient votes in the Mexican Senate to make this happen. And there is a debate taking place right now as to whether there's somehow a language that could be approved by the Mexican Senate, by Mexican senators from the opposition, that would eventually allow for the legislators of the lower house to then vote on it. There would be a new constitutional reform. Can you just give us a sense what happened? I mean, what are the objectives of this language? And then let's talk about what should be the legislation that should be debated right now. So just kind of put us into context what happened this week.
Well, first, thank you very much for having me, Ana Maria. Always a pleasure. There have been a number of discussions on the armed forces, their role in law enforcement, and the National Guard, which is this body that was created in 2019. It is a couple of weeks ago, they approved a bill that is likely to be deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, whereby operational and budgetary control over the National Guard was passed to the Defense Ministry, even though it remains administrative within the purview of the Security Ministry. So that is that was a run around a constitutional prohibition against direct military involvement in law enforcement. We'll see what happens to that. That was just normal legislation, so they only needed a majority, a simple majority. But then, in parallel, they pushed in the lower house of Congress a bill to reform a transitory article of the constitutional reform passed in 2019, whereby the armed forces the president could use the armed forces directly for law enforcement purposes for a period of 5 years within a set of conditions. That term is that clause will end in 2024, in March 2024. So the bill that was presented by a member of the so-called opposition in the lower house of Congress would extend that to 2028. The bill was approved in the lower house of Congress with 2/3 majority, and then passed to the Senate, where it also needs a 2/3 majority. However, so that they want to extend this from 2024 to 2028. In terms that the people from the U.S. want this is something of a posse comitatus doctrine in Mexico, whereby the military cannot supposedly engage directly in law enforcement, but this was an exception and extraordinary
circumstances or law. It was extraordinary legislation for extraordinary threats, I think.
Having said that, so they did not find the sufficient votes. They put this to a vote they sent to committee. It moved through committee very quickly. Then they put it to. They wanted to put it to a vote in the Senate on Wednesday. However, when the vote was coming up, suddenly the majority leader, Ricardo Monreal, realized that they didn't have the votes, that the bill was going to be defeated on the floor of the Senate, probably by 1 or 2 or 3 votes. So they decided to pull it back with, some legislative hanky-panky went through in that measure, but they said to pull it back, and they would try again in a few days. Will it be approved? I don't know. Allegedly there's a negotiation going on between the members of the ruling party, Morena, and of the PRI, of the senators of the PRI, to create some set of conditions for extending military involvement in law enforcement. One would be probably not, the extension would not be to 4 years, would be 2 years. The other would be that they would have to be paired with increased funding for state and local law enforcement. There might be some oversight mechanisms put in place. However, that was also kind of the negotiation in 2019 when this was initially approved. It never came to fruition. The government never had any intention of actually following through on those commitments, and it's likely not. There is absolutely no mechanism to force
the
government to actually keep its word on this. So I think it would be either terribly naive or either they're terribly pressured to put this to a vote, and this is just a face-saving mechanism.
I guess I'm trying to understand, why is this? It's urgent because we do have a deadline, which is 2024, right? In which technically, at least according to the Constitution, the armed forces should not be involved in public security matters. So if they eventually succeed, because they still have a problem that the Guard, the National Guard, is supposed to be part still technically of the Secretary of Public Security, even though they have this law that's unconstitutional, right?
This has been a masterclass in obfuscation, because this is the thing: the National Guard, even with the reform they passed 2 weeks ago, which again, it would likely to be deemed unconstitutional in a couple, maybe when it reaches the court, maybe in a couple of years. It is still technically a civilian institution. It is not part of the permanent armed forces. So if they want to keep military personnel doing law enforcement, they have the vehicle. The vehicle, will just transfer personnel to the National Guard. What's the problem? What as much as you want. What's the problem? This is the thing. I think this is plan A. National Guard is plan B. The National Guard is they just want it as a vehicle for direct involvement of the armed forces in law enforcement, and as a way for the armed forces, they seem to think, not absurdly, that if they take responsibility for this most serious of problems in the most serious of public policy problems in Mexico, if they somewhat solve the problem for civilians, and particularly for President López Obrador, they're apt to gain a lot of power, influence, and budgets.
That's why, yeah.
I think that's kind of the trade-off for them.
Yeah.
But this is important. They're not willing to draw a clear-cut distinction between the National Guard and the Army.
And that's what's so worrisome. I mean, I think that's what, that you don't separate the role of the Army and the tools that the Army has and the training the Army has from the National Guard. Yeah. And I think that is what's most worrisome. And I think it sounds like it's an administrative nightmare for the Army or the Ministry of Defense, because they have their resources from the Army and the resources in the National Guard are just kind of together, and they're kind of meshed together. And when the day comes that the National Guard eventually is going to have to be a civilian institution, or they're going to have to disappear it. But when that happens, a lot of resources from the Army have been invested in the National Guard.
That's correct. And personnel, equipment facilities that that are part of the Army, of the Armed Forces, are technically part of the National Guard. So drawing a clear-cut distinction would indeed imply losing personnel, resources, budget. So what they're doing is, instead of doing, okay, let's force a constitutional debate. Let's create a cohesive constitutional
strategy
and legal structure. Instead of doing that, they're doing these runarounds that, when the time comes for, if and when a less compliant, a government of a different political sign comes to power, they are likely to face severe questioning of all the decisions they're taking right now. This is the thing. In terms of administrative responsibility, this is going to be nightmarish, because
it's going to be
you have someone, an agency, using the budget from another agency. So who's responsible for that? Let's say there's some missing payments. Let's say there's some corruption. Who's responsible for that? Or
is it the Secretary of the Defense? Is it going to be who's responsible? Right.
Or even worse, let's say that there's some lower rank officers that are involved in a corruption scheme. Say in a corruption scheme within the National Guard. Should that be tried in a civilian court or in a military court? Because
that's a big issue.
Allegedly, they committed a fraud in a civilian institution.
Yeah, but they are.
This is likely to create a lot of legal uncertainty for a very long time.
Let me ask you this, because we have a couple minutes left. What should happen? I mean, you and I have debated this. We've talked about this throughout the years. Clearly, when you have criminal organizations as dangerous and as violent as Mexico's criminal organizations, you need to have the participation of the armed forces. I mean, and we kind of had debated about it. The role has been, what should they do and whether they have the legal authority? What should happen at this point? Since you have the Army.
This is the thing. Okay, they wanted an intermediate force. Now they have it. Use it.
And they're not using it.
They're not using it. So that was allegedly the way out of using the armed forces directly. So use it. Or you don't want to use it. Okay, fine. So you still want to use the armed forces directly. So let's set a mechanism for emergency for emergency use of those resources. There is an article in Mexican Constitution, Article 29 of the Mexican Constitution, that basically is the article regulating a potential state of siege.
Yeah, and they've never wanted to use that.
If you argue that the situation is so dangerous that you need all the resources of the state to deal with that danger, then you're really you're not in a normal situation. So you should declare something akin to a state of siege with rules, subject to democratic controls, subject to the time limits, subject to geographic boundaries. Why should we legislate for the whole country when the emergency is in some place like Michoacán?
Right.
Why not have any? They wanted to have their National Guard. Now they have it. Use it. And if they want, if they claim that there's need for even more than that, then let's start let's start having a legislative debate on how to regulate a potential state of siege, an emergency situation that calls for extraordinary circumstances.
Resources, yeah.
And this is the thing. That is not the relevant security and justice agenda in Mexico. Neither of those things.
Right.
I mean, none of that deals with the fact that most crimes in Mexico are never reported. Most crimes that are reported are never investigated, and most crimes that are investigated are never properly brought to trial. Those issues, that's 95% of the problem. Those problems are not being addressed by putting boots on the ground, will not be addressed by putting boots on the ground in a year, in 2 years, or in 4 years. That is the agenda we should be dealing with.
It's always good. It's always good to talk to you. Clearly we have to see what's going to happen in the Senate in the next week, and at the end of the day, what this debate's going to look like, because there is a lot of concern now that there is literally very little capability by state and local authorities to address extremely violent organizations.
Yeah,
and it doesn't
I think that's part of the narrative of the. I mean, we're thinking from the position of an emergency or a narrative.
Right.
It's the army or the abyss. I think we should be questioning that premise. In most of the country, it's simply not true. In most of the country, the army could withdraw tomorrow and nothing would happen.
But they're not doing anything. They're not doing anything to strengthen the abilities.
But you don't need finish. But again, even if you don't do anything,
right?
What you have right now, if you actually look at the numbers of what the army actually does, not what it claims it does, what it actually does
is nothing.
It's
very little,
really small. Is it the fact that we should start having this discussion with facts and with evidence, and not with apocalyptic images of Mad Max, gone astray. That is not what we're facing. In most of why should there be army involvement in law enforcement in a place like Mérida or in a place like Aguascalientes?
Right.
Why should, I mean, most of the country and this is even the government itself recognizes that most lethal violence is concentrated in a few municipalities.
A few states, municipalities, in fact.
Why? Where is the evidence that say if you withdraw the army directly from law enforcement in a place like I don't know, in a place like Campeche, all hell will break loose? That's not true. That's simply not true. And I think I would love for some governments to actually call the army's bluff. So we're not going to patrol. Fine. Okay. No. We're going to leave. Okay.
What will happen?
I would vote for the government that did that.
Oh, wow. Let's do this. I ran out of time. It's always great to have you on the show. You publish in El Universal, just remind our audience, twice a week or three times a week?
Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You can also follow me on Twitter, Hope71, and at El Universal, and 3 times a week.
It's great. It's always great. It's always interesting to read, and you had a really great piece this week, which we ran out of time to talk about what should happen now. I mean, what should be the proposal by the government. So maybe you'll come on the show as we're starting to understand what's happening in the Senate. We should be talking about the future. It's always great to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you very
so
much.
And we're going to go to a break. This is Living in Mexico. We'll be back. Don't go away.